Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Ben the Boat Painter, a relaxing look at life on the canals as we paint two 48-foot narrowboats. Plenty of work to do today, of course, but the first thing we need to do is move our boats upriver. And it's such a beautiful day, why don't you come and join us? And away we go, out of the first lock of the day, and I think there's only one more lock we need to do before we get to Broxbourne, which is our intended destination. We are ultimately travelling further upriver. We are travelling up the River Lee at the moment, but then we're going to be turning off at the River Sport in maybe 2 or 3 weeks, which I'm very much looking forward to because I have not taken the boat on the River Sport for a number of years, over 10 years. And here we are in Broxbourne, just about ready to moor up. And while we're here, we've got lots of work to do. In this week in particular, we're going to be stripping paint. We're going to be scraping old paint off, we're going to be treating rust, we're going to be applying primer, and we're going to be putting on our first coat of Undercoat too. But before all that, it's just a question of mooring up in this conveniently situated space without hitting anything. And although I don't expect Broxbourne to be teeming with wildlife in quite the way Cheshunt was, I'm sure we'll find plenty of little natural wonders to marvel at. Okay, so here we are, securely moored up after that lovely journey. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Going to continue work on the roof, of course. In particular, we want to look at this very rough patch we identified in episode 3. As you can see, it's got a decent coverage of paint, but it still looks very ugly. And water is just going to accumulate in here, and we don't want to risk the same problem as before. In addition to the roof, we need to find something else to do now because if you imagine, putting a coat of paint on the roof only really takes 2 hours. So as much as I'd like it to, that doesn't really constitute a full day's work. So we need to find something else to fill up the day. And I'm thinking perhaps the back hatch actually, because we saw that ladybird looking very interested at some of these rust patches. So once the roof is finished, it's going to make the back hatch look really, really ugly. So I think this would be quite a good candidate for something else to do. Okay, and on top of the hatch and the roof, I think it's going to help to have a third job to get on with, because there's going to be occasions when the tasks we need to do on the hatch and the roof are going to clash with each other. For example, if I've just painted the hatch, I'm not going to then want to go and sand the roof because the dust from the roof is going to contaminate the wet paint on the hatch. So for a third job, I think the back deck would be ideal. And oh look, there's some baby ducklings over there. Isn't that nice? There they go. Yes, the back deck. So the reasons we want to do the back deck pretty soon is because we want to sort out this area here where we've recently had the welding work done. We've only got a layer of primer protecting it, and you can see there's the rust coming through already. As well as that, you remember I was a little bit concerned about the lack of non-slip here. So I think we want to make getting in and out of the boat a lot safer, because that can get very slippery there. So we've got our work cut out here, haven't we? Okay, so we've got our filler here, ready to start work on this horrible rough area. And we're going to need quite a lot in there. We won't be able to do it just with one pass of the filler. We might have to come back 2 or 3 times and then sand it smooth before we're ready to put another coat of paint on top. So let's just scoop a bit out. You can't have too much really, because once you add the hardener, the filler's going to start to harden before perhaps you've finished the job. So just tend to do a little bit at a time. About right. There we go. Mix it all up and it'll start to harden. And then we can get started. Okay, I think I'm going to leave that for now, let that harden up, and we'll go over again with another layer of filler. In the meantime, we've got the filler that hasn't hardened yet. There's these other little cracks, and there's a little spot here we need to do, so we can use this for these other surrounding areas too. So Okay, so we nearly got that bit, but that'll still need another layer. Okay, so this should be ready to go over again in about 20 minutes or so. Just about time for a cup of tea, I think. Do you remember that muntjac that was eating nettles in episode 4? Well, that gives me an idea. If it's good enough for a muntjac, it's good enough for me. So why don't we stop and make ourselves a cup of nettle tea? I popped outside and snipped the tops off some very fresh looking nettles, filled this saucepan up, put them into a saucepan of very hot boiling water, boiled them for 1 minute, pulled them out of the pot, squeezed the juice out of them, poured the contents into my cup, topped it up with the water that I boiled it in, bit of milk and honey in that, and we're good to go. Oh yeah, that's really good actually. Oh. Okay, we'll do one more layer for now. Give it a very thorough sand down, get it as flat as we can. And then once we've put another coat of paint on it, we'll see how it looks. Maybe we'll keep going, but for now we'll just do one more. Okay, so here we are at the other end of the boat, and we're going to need to leave that filler to dry for some time before we go back and sand it. So why don't we turn our attention to the back hatch? And I think we're going to take a different approach to this than perhaps any of the other areas of the boat. I'm going to try and strip the paint off completely. Now, why am I going to do that? Well, you'll see the dark areas here. That means I've already had a little go at the rusty patches with some rust treatment. But as I was doing that, I realised the paint is very thin and it's actually coming off quite easily. So I really want this area to be very, very smooth, very shiny, because this is like the first thing you see as you step onto the boat. So I want it to be like a real kind of showcase of good painting technique. And we're going to paint it in a very glossy, dark colour anyway, so any imperfections are going to just show up so much because of that. And because the paint's so thin, it means these imperfections are very shallow. So if I try to fill them, the filler's going to behave as if I'm just dragging it across a completely smooth surface anyway, so I don't think it's going to do anything. So stripping the paint off, I think, is the best solution if we want a really beautifully smooth, shiny finish. And always a gatekeeper over there. We've already seen one of them, haven't we? But first time we've had a chance to look at that lovely underwing pattern. Very nice. Where was I? Ah yes, work. Okay, let's get this paint stripper on. Usually need 2 coats. Perhaps I haven't got quite enough of that, but just need a bit of encouragement to get this paint off. It's so thin, it should come off quite easily anyway. Cheapo brush, and the only thing left to do is to get started. But before we do that, let's have another little look at those ducklings we saw earlier on in the episode. These are mallard ducklings, but there was something bugging me about them. See that dark one there? That is not actually a mallard because it dives and none of the others do. So amazingly, these 2 dark ducklings are not mallards, they are in fact tufted ducks. So I have no idea what they're doing with this family. I'm hoping they're going to get reunited with their parent. Well, we may check in on those ducklings a little bit later to see how they're getting on, but we have work to do, of course, as always, and we have fast forwarded to the point where all the paint has been stripped off the hatch. And if you want to see paint stripper in action, particularly, then don't despair, just stay tuned, and we're going to do the same thing on the back deck a little bit later. So you can see that it's not just a uniform shiny metal surface. There are dark and light patches there. Well, the dark patches, as we've explained earlier, are the slightly rusty areas that had already been exposed by missing paint, and I've treated them with a rust treatment and they've gone dark, as they should. There are also, however, these much lighter kind of white patches around the edge of the hatch. Now, I was not expecting to see that, and what that is filler. And obviously, during the construction of the hatch, it's created some sort of surface imperfections around the edges of the hatch, and then someone has gone round and smoothed out those imperfections with the filler. The problem is that as I was scraping off the paint, the sharp scraper was actually creating some quite ugly marks in the filler. So we're going to have to go round again and smooth those areas off once we've put some undercoat on. And if you remember, when we applied our coats of primer onto the roof, the primer was almost completely matte. It wasn't shiny in the slightest. Whereas I'm using the same primer here, but now it looks very shiny. And the reason for that is I've added some Oatrol into the primer. Now, we had a brief look at Oatrol in episode 2, and I mentioned that it's used often as a rust inhibitor. So that's one of the reasons that I've added it to the primer here, because we're painting onto bare metal. It's quite a good idea to add a bit of extra protection. But one benefit I didn't mention in episode 2 actually was that it causes the paint to take longer to dry. So why is that good? Well, in this case, it's going to create a smoother surface. So primer usually dries very quickly. Any brush marks, more of a chance to smooth out as the paint dries. So we're going to get a smoother finish. Just bailing out the rowing boat from last night's torrential rain. Ready to start work on the back deck. It's a lot more comfortable working from the rowing boat actually. You know, imagine I don't want to be crawling around on my knees on this hard surface. And yeah, a lot of elbow grease required for this thing. Sanding, brushing, scraping. Okay, can't put it off any longer, can I? Let's get cracking. Okay, the name of the game here is just to remove any loose flaky paint. If the paint is not stuck on properly, we just want to get rid of it completely. It's going to do us no good leaving it on there, so it doesn't matter if we expose a bit of bare metal in the process. We're just going to go around and treat any rust that we exposed, or any existing rust that's already showing. Using the scraper, brush and sandpaper in equal measure probably. Important to get around those little nooks and crannies. You've got to do this job thoroughly, because anything you miss is, I would say, guaranteed to fail down the line. So there's no shortcuts. Do it quickly or you can do it properly, as I like to say. It's a bit of an annoying phrase, isn't it? But I am working very quickly here, as we see, and hopefully I'm doing it properly. I'm certainly trying to anyway. Niggly nooks and crannies there. And here we are, as promised earlier on, here is our paint stripper. I mean, you could decant it into a little pot and then dip your brush in, but I like to just, it's quite thick, so it's kind of like gel, so it doesn't come out in a rush. You've got quite a lot of control over how you do it. And just using a very cheap brush, because there's no refinement or finesse required at all. And the trick with this particular brand of paint stripper is you apply one generous coat, leave it for 20 minutes or so, and then come back, apply another coat. And so I'm doing a little bit more sanding while I wait for that to act. I mean, I've got to say, paint stripper, it's not particularly pleasant stuff. Here comes the second coat. But because of my sort of physical limitations, I cannot make any noise, you see. So even just manual scraping of paint is going to be unfortunately, too noisy for me. So on goes the second coat of paint stripper, and you just kind of work it in. It's more than a case of just painting it on. You've got to kind of rub it in, and try and work it through any little holes in the paint, that kind of thing. There we go, so we leave that for another 20 minutes, and then what happens is the paint should start sort of bubbling up and lifting off the metal. So really there's very little effort required in removing the paint, which is what I'm interested in. I never used to use paint stripper years ago. I would use power tools and then switch to using a scraper and perhaps a hammer. But now I like to keep things, you know me, I like to keep things nice and quiet. So this, although admittedly it's quite a toxic substance, it's basically the only way I can do it now, unfortunately. I mean, you've got to be very, very careful not to get any of this in the river, of course. It goes without saying. And off we go. I mean, you can see I'm using 2 hands there, but I'm able to strip this paint just using 1 hand. I'm not putting that much force in at all. It's coming off very easily. It's not going back to bare metal, to be fair, but what I'm really interested in here is getting off that non-slip texture, that kind of sandpaper-like texture, because that's very difficult to paint over effectively. So I'm very keen to get rid of that. So once that's gone, then I'm confident we're going to be able to get a nice paint job on this rear deck here, and then we can redo the non-slip texture ourselves. Last little bit, get it all into a little pile there. It's quite easy to ensure that it doesn't go in the water, to be fair, because it's not like dust, it doesn't kind of blow away in the wind or anything. Brushing the last little bits up, and also I'll probably go back again, here we go, yeah, with the scraper, because it's, you know, the colour of the surface is not uniform, it is quite difficult to see if you've got everything off. And here we go with our rust treatment. Now I'm going to go, although we haven't completely exposed it all as bare metal, we're just going to go over the whole thing, because just to ensure that we cover every bit of bare metal we can. And also around those little bits we've exposed around the border of the deck. And then we can leave it to do its thing. Well, while that's drying, why don't we have a little stroll down the towpath and see what we can see in the hedgerow. So, although not teeming with wildlife, this towpath hedgerow has quite enough to keep me happy, including this harlequin ladybird, and as we will see, there are a plethora of different types. This is also a harlequin ladybird. It's as if its black spots are so big, it's formed one black block there, leaving 2 red spots. This is native to the UK, unlike the harlequin ladybird we've just seen, and this is the 7-spot ladybird. It's probably the one you're most likely to see after the harlequin ladybird. Looking very different here, this is the 22-spot ladybird. Tiny little things these are, and you'll notice the little male on top there, he is very tiny. The female's a little bit bigger than he is. And when I was little, these were my favourites. The 14-spot, I quite liked the fact that it almost reminded me of a little face on the back. Quite like those unusual oblong spots. Now this, I did hope that this was a pine ladybird, which is quite unusual. However, in the same way we saw that black harlequin ladybird, this is the black form of a 2-spot ladybird. It looks very, very similar to the pine ladybird, which is in fact quite rare. Now, this last one. This was a tricky one to identify. I thought this was what's generally known as an inconspicuous ladybird, which you very, very rarely see. They're very small, have no spots. But this is in fact a 24-spot ladybird. It just happens to have no spots. So figure that one out. This is like a no-spot ladybird. Anyway, after that brief little detour down the hedgerow, it's time to get back to work. And the rust treatment has had its 4 hours to take effect. So we can see it's got a kind of dark purpley colour. And after a light sand, we can go on and add our first layer of primer. Now, the surface of that deck is quite rough, so this first coat is not going to produce a particularly smooth finish, far from it, to be honest. But the fact that we are, of course, going to build up many layers of paint on this deck, imagine we're going to be walking on it every day, basically, so we do need a really nice coverage of paint. But in addition to that, we are going to add quite a coarse layer of non-slip on top. So really, whether the surface is a little bit rough or smooth is not going to make much difference at all, because most of that surface is going to look like kind of a rough sandpaper anyway, so the smoothness of the surface is not completely essential in this case. And there goes our last little bit of primer. So we've finished the 3 coats of primer on both the back deck and the back hatch. And it's time to turn our attention to Undercoat. Now, if you watched episode 2, you may recall that we established if you're going to paint something red, it's highly advisable to use a correctly matched undercoat. Now, this is the colour we're going to go for the back hatch of Scarlet and parts of the back deck. Nice, deep, rich red colour. Alongside it, we have this Craftmaster mid-red undercoat, which is essentially bright pink. So, strictly speaking, this undercoat is probably a bit light for such a deep red colour. But as luck would have it, we have alongside it some black undercoat. So, given that we want to use what we've got, I think the best solution would be to mix some of this black in with the mid-red colour to create a more appropriate undercoat for this darker shade. And this is one I've sort of mixed up earlier. See, it's kind of a purpley colour. Not exactly right, perhaps, but it's close enough, I think, and this will be fine. So we can put this to use. And I think we better put it to use pretty quickly because I'm starting to get a bit high here off these fumes. And away we go. Got my vapour mask on now, thankfully. So after a quick sand, it's time to put on our first little bit of undercoat. It's nice to get a bit of colour on here. And we're being pretty careful about how we're applying the paint now because we're getting closer to the final coat, so we don't want any irregular brush marks. Although having said that, you will notice that not every single brush mark I'm doing is vertical. The ones at the very edge there are kind of diagonal, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to avoid making any drips down the edges of the hatch, particularly at the edge closest to the camera, because of course I can't see what I'm doing there, so I just have to have faith that I'm not creating any drips. Haven't done any so far. The drips they're actually a little bit hard to get rid of, in fact, because once they've hardened, it's actually quite, you've got quite a thick lot of paint there, so it takes a little while to sand them off. And you can see I'm painting over the undercoat I've already applied, and the reason I'm doing that is I'm trying to smooth down the paint as much as possible. A technique called laying off, in which you stroke the brush over the paint just very, very lightly, just to try and smooth off the surface of the paint. Very careful not to get any paint on that handle. I can't really be well, let me sound a bit bad. I can't really be bothered to mask off these little fitments. It's just an extra bit of material, extra cost, extra time. So I think it's find it a little bit more efficient just to take a bit of extra care when you're doing that kind of thing. So, and to be fair as well, that brass handle is quite old and it already has some marks on it anyway. So it's not like it's pristine to start off with anyway. And I'm actually able to work, take my time here and work quite slowly because the sun's not out, it's quite cool, so the paint is drying quite slowly, relatively speaking, so I can afford to take my time. And that is also going to help with the smoothness of the finish as well, because as we mentioned earlier with the primer that we'd added the Owatrol into, the longer the paint takes to dry, the more of a chance the brush strokes have to kind of flatten out as the paint dries. And just the last little bit there, with the diagonal brush strokes again on the edge. And I say that's a good job well done there, I think. Very nice. That's starting to look nice now. But we're going to have to wait for that to dry before we do anything more on the back hatch. So let's turn our attention to undercoating the back deck. And we're going to have two colours here. For the main deck area, we're going to have grey to match the roof. And for the border, we're going to go with that lovely dark, rich red colour we looked at earlier. And of course, we have our two different undercoat colours ready to go. In addition to that, there are quite a few imperfections around this area in particular. And I'm going to want to lay some filler down just to smooth them off, because the paint we're using is going to be very shiny, quite dark. So that's going to really show up any irregularities in the surface. So we want to get this as smooth as possible. And I want to undercoat it first before we do that, because it's going to be a lot easier to see which imperfections need the most attention once everything's the same colour. But before all that, we're going to need to give these primed areas a light sand, and then we can start painting. And here we go again, starting off with a light sand with our 180 grit sandpaper, and a little rub down with a tack cloth afterwards to get rid of any dust. Didn't sand down the red painted areas because they've already been sanded, so no need to go over them again. And on with our first little bit of undercoat. Important to paint the areas in the specific order. You know, I don't want to paint around the tiller area and then have to lean over to paint the deck. So we're going to paint it in the sort of a logical sequence. On with our different coloured undercoat for the back deck. I'm using, well, for the size of the area, I'm using quite a small brush, but it's going to give us a bit more control as we're painting around the hinges and the hook and the little brass plaque in the top left corner there. So it's not a very big area anyway, so it's not going to lose us too much time. And you can see that technique of just starting with a little bit of a gap in between our new paint and the existing paint, and then working it in. And you can see that little brush coming in handy there at the end. Time to switch to our pink undercoat again. We've got to be careful not to drip any pink onto the other. There you go. I spoke too soon, didn't I? Anyway, it's too late. Well, it's only the first coat, we can paint over it, but ideally we want to avoid any smudges or drips, stuff like that. Very important to get in all the nooks and crannies, don't want to miss anything. There we go. Those side areas that we step on to come in, they're pretty, I mean, you can see the right hand one is actually pretty rough, but like the back deck, they're going to have some very coarse non-slip over them, so it's not so important that they're super smooth. I mean, at the moment, this area that we're painting now, this is not smooth at all. This is quite rough, so we are going to have to deal with this because yeah, it's going to be shiny. We want it to look nice. It's not going to have the non-slip on, so it's really going to show up any imperfections, of which there are quite a lot. And the last little bits, fiddly little bits, all important. Here we go. Just around the fuel cap to finish. No, I've forgotten it. Anyway, okay, we'll come back and do that later. Here we are on the rear hatch of Scarlet, putting on our second coat of undercoat, and this time we can take full advantage of the chemical bond of the paint, and there's no need to sand in between coats because I can actually feel it's still got a little bit of tackiness to it. This is going to help us build up the layers of undercoat quickly, which is good. We want a few layers of undercoat. So the undercoat is there not only to stick the top coat onto the surface of the paint, but if we build up many coats of it, it's going to help us smooth out these rough areas in the corner, which we exposed when we stripped the paint. You remember that? Oh look, there's a white butterfly over there. Looks like a small white probably. Ah, there it goes. Just a fleeting glimpse that time. Hasn't been the best year for butterflies this year, actually. There's quite a few we haven't seen yet. Haven't seen Painted Lady. Haven't seen Tortoise Shell. But hopefully we'll get a view of a lot more as the episodes roll on. Where was I though? Paint, of course. Yes, and it's a good time to put on our coats of undercoat because I've checked the weather forecast. There's no rain for the next few days. So that means we're going to be able to put on our coats on consecutive days without interruption. And on that note, I think the next thing to do is to put some paint on. So here we go again. We've seen this film before, haven't we? Only this time we're actually painting pink onto pink. So, I mean, maybe there's not actually that much to look at here. I know. Shall we leave this young man to his painting, and why don't we go and have a little wander around and see what we can see in the way of wildlife? Maybe we'll see those ducks again. I wonder how they're getting on. Yep, come on, let's leave him to it. We're going to have a look at something more interesting. Come on. And straight away, we've stumbled across a great crested grebe, one of my favourite birds that you find here in the Lee Valley. And this particular one has two little passengers riding piggyback. These baby grebes really do look quite unusual. Like little humbugs with their black and white striped feathers. And seems to me like they've just woken up, and maybe they've been sleeping soundly under those wings. And I know they're back again. I know they're out. And here we have the whole family, mum, dad, and the two little ones. And oh, mind your head! Ow! Oh dear! And the little grebe on the right, it's making a break for freedom. First taste of independence, and it's just done a big poo in the water. Well, I suppose that was polite, wasn't it? I suppose nice and potty trained. Do a poo and then back in under the wing. Very funny little things, aren't they? And now, look at this. The dad has got a feather, and it's passing the feather to one of the babies, taking it back, and then it's passing the same feather to the other baby. Very odd piece of behaviour, that, and to my mind, I don't think anyone really knows why they do this. So, yeah, quite mysterious creatures, these grebes. Always enjoy seeing them. And here we have some older young, very proficient in diving there. And you know what that diving reminds me of? It's those little tufted ducklings we saw earlier on in the episode, and here they are. So they seem like they're on their own now. Wow. Have they broken away from the mallard family? And wait, look. Yes, they're back in the fold. Back where they belong, with their tufted duck family. And what a brilliant way to draw this week's episode to a close. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'd be thrilled if you could connect with the channel in any way you see fit, either liking, subscribing or commenting. And I very much hope to see you all back at the boat in our next episode.